Florence was more than a pretty girl. She was beautiful, the dream of any man with eyes in his head. She knew it too, and more than once she had benefited from the foolishness and superficiality of men who did little else but admire her, sometimes secretly, often not. She had been cherished and appreciated for her beauty for as long as she could remember. And yet in all that time, only 2 men had ever told her, "I love you." The chief minister's bedroom was dark, still, silent. Second after second passed with a hollow rhythm, one after the other. Most of the lamps in the room were switched off. The only light came from the fireplace, where the last stubborn flames cast everything in restless flickers of orange and red. The rest of the room lay cold and cloaked in shadow. It had been raining for hours. The blunt sound of raindrops, steady and unrelenting, was the only thing the 2 unmoving figures could hear. The fire was fading now, its former grandeur reduced to a bed of crackling red embers. As it died, so too did the light. And still, nothing else changed. Drop after drop. Persistent, constant, echoing, never stopping. The rain hammered the streets and splashed against the window panes with relentless energy. It seemed more alive than anything else around them.
"Yes, Florence, I am desperately and tragically in love with you."
Nothing had changed since he said it. Not a single thing. After the chief minister's last words, the room fell still. Angus remained near the fireplace, unmoving, his gaze fixed on her. Florence sat on the edge of the bed like a stone statue, motionless, carved by silence. Her eyes held a disorienting cocktail of emotion, indifference, apathy, reproach, and sorrow. Time ticked on, but only the fire diminished. Everything else was frozen in its wake. Angus stood there, watching her with the intensity of a man who had given too much of himself and received too little in return. He studied her as if any motion, a blink, a breath, might break the spell. But she didn't move. He stayed like that, desperate for her to react, and yet equally overwhelmed by the urge to speak again. Words churned in his skull, some tender, some bitter, kindness twisted with spite. His thoughts knotted themselves into something painful, pulsing just beneath his skin like they might burst through his temples. He wasn't finished. He couldn't be. There was still so much left unsaid about his confusion and his certainty, his fury and tenderness, his hatred and his love. Angus's lips were itching to speak, to break the silence, but he couldn't. It was as if every word he wanted to say had gotten stuck in his throat, as if his mind was no longer master of his body. He just stared at her, blindly, drowning in an ocean of painful emotion. What had he just said? Why had he said it? He certainly hadn't planned to say it, not like that. Not so pathetically. In fact, he hadn't planned to say any of it at all. And then, when he finally did decide to speak, he'd intended it to sound masculine, powerful, strong, heroic. What happened instead was panic. He started thinking out loud and couldn't stop. He'd ended up whining like a child, and there was no way to shut himself up. Did he mean what he said? Of course he did. He wouldn't have said it otherwise. And yet the calm that came from finally admitting it to himself, finally acknowledging the truth of how he felt, was now replaced by the excruciating anxiety of waiting to see how she would react. He loved her, but the moment he said it, he wished he hadn't. He had completely exposed himself, laid bare his suffering, his longing, his deepest shame. Not lust, but love. And with that he had made himself a slave at her feet. Still, there was more. So much more he wanted to confess. He wanted to take back his words, and yet he also longed to expose more, to spill every bit of torment, every shred of frustration and love she had carved into him. But right now, he could do neither. Right now he had to wait and watch. Angus wanted nothing more than to say how sorry he was, to fall to his knees and beg for her forgiveness, to plead miserably for her mercy, the same way a sinner seeks it from God. But even in his dazed, desperate state, he saw her eyes, so indifferent, so scorching, so frozen, locked on his. She was silent, and still seemingly devoid of emotion. And though his own face was just as unreadable, he wasn't delusional. He knew better. After all he had done to her, no regret or declaration of love could undo it. Still, he waited. Angus was desperately, madly, obsessively clinging to her response. Florence suddenly shifted her head, breaking the stare. Her eyes dropped from his down to the floor, her feet. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't stay still and silent, not when her mind was being torn apart by so many thoughts. The simple movement of her eyes was the first thing she'd done in what felt like forever, and she was sure, more than sure, that Angus had noticed it. The room was still dimly lit, just enough that she could make out the spot on the floor she seemed to be staring at so intently. But in truth, she wasn't really seeing it at all, because she was remembering. She had been the one who started this. She had asked him, earlier that day, if he loved her. She remembered asking, but now somehow she couldn't quite remember why. Why had she demanded that of him? What had she been hoping to gain? Whatever her reasons, she knew this much now. She wished she'd never done it. Of course, it didn't change anything. Of course, nothing he could say or do would ever make her hate him less. And yet, her mind wouldn't let go. It kept replaying his words again and again. Words she'd only heard once before. Words she'd convinced herself, back then, were never truly sincere. Sincere. Involuntarily, Florence wondered how the same phrase, "I love you," could sound and mean such different things when said by different people. When Elijah had told her he loved her, it was light, maybe even mechanical, but gentle, tender. It made her feel warm, seen, but she didn't feel that now. When she recalled the words from Elijah's lips, all she felt was betrayal, lied to, stupid, and yet some foolish part of her still clung to the hope that maybe he had meant it, that maybe he would come back for her. No, he never would. How delusional was she? She sighed, deep and heavy, but still didn't dare move. She had heard it for a second time now. "I love you." But this time it felt so different. How could those same words carry such darkness, such torment? She was no longer looking at Angus, but she could still see him in her mind. The obsession in his stare, the bitterness in his voice, the way he'd answered her question, a question that was never really supposed to be answered. Shivers crept over her skin, but she couldn't stop thinking about it, about every accusation, every wretched confession he had made to her that evening.
I knew you were sent for my perdition, and I know it still. But did I care? Do I care? No. Only with one look, you cursed me with a blissful hell.
She suddenly lifted her head to stare out the window. The rain was still falling, heavy, relentless. She listened to it numbly, letting the sharp hammer of each drop fill the silence. Even now, even when he tried to tell her he loved her, it felt more like a verdict. Like he was proclaiming that he was guiltless and she was to blame. Was that what he thought love was? Because his version of it, whatever it was, brought nothing but humiliation, nothing but pain, physical, psychological. It hurt, and yet somehow she knew. She knew that Angus's declaration of love was more sincere, more real than anything Elijah had ever said to her. She turned slightly, just enough to glance at Angus from the corner of her eye. He was still by the fireside, still motionless. She looked back down at the floor again. She knew. She knew he was waiting for her response, that her reaction was the only thing he was waiting for. Florence swallowed hard and closed her eyes. The weight of the day, of the past, came crashing over her like a wave. Every wound, every memory, rushing back in all at once. Angus had done so much evil to her. He had tortured people, so many people, just to find her. He had threatened her again and again until she finally surrendered. He had taken her virginity with brutal disregard, and ever since that moment, he had used her however he pleased, raping and abusing her whenever the urge struck. Even then, he had forced her to abort the child he had put inside her. Her body had suffered through kinds of pain she never could have imagined, tortures she couldn't put into words. But there we were. Florence stared down at the floor again, her mind dragging her through each awful memory. Most were recent, too recent. The last 3 days alone had left her bruised and aching, her muscles sore even now from his recklessness. And now, the torturer, the criminal, the merciless villain stood there, telling her he loved her. How was she supposed to react to something like that? How could she ever believe him? And why should she even care? She exhaled shakily, shoulders rising and falling beneath the crushing weight of it all. Hatred, sorrow, pain, and the even more terrifying realization that Angus was being completely honest. Slowly she placed her feet more steadily on the floor. Then with agonizing slowness, she stood up, feeling every sore muscle, every hurt tendon protest the movement. Her eyes stayed stubbornly fixed on the ground, head bowed. She didn't look at him, only at her feet, step after step, as she walked toward the fire. She stopped just before it, keeping the wide stone hearth and the glowing orange embers between them. A literal divide. Still, she didn't raise her head. But Angus hadn't looked away once. He had watched her obsessively, every motion, every blink, every falter, and now he stared at her body like a man possessed, eyes burning into her like she was the last sacred thing on earth. But Florence was frozen again, made of stone. She had no idea what to say. Standing up had reawakened everything he'd done to her. The brutality, the trauma, the humiliation, the truth.
I know I've done things to you. Horrible things.
His voice broke the silence, quiet but unflinching.
I know I've hurt you in more ways than I could name, and I know you could only hate me for it.
Her head lifted slightly, only a fraction, just enough to see the hem of his cassock hanging motionless over his boots. Oh yes, she hated him, but it was even more than that. She despised him, loathed him, longed for his death. What difference did it make that he admitted to his cruelty? He hadn't even tried to regret it. He'd simply stated it, like facts on a page. For a brief burning second she imagined lunging at him, slapping him hard across the face again and again. She imagined punching his chest, cursing at him through her tears, shrieking in his face, laughing cruelly at every one of his pitiful words until they dissolved into ash. But she did none of that. The bedroom remained silent, save for the whispering crackle of the dying fire and the endless drum of rain on glass.
The first night I was with you, I felt hell itself surrounding me, claiming me, burning me.
She stirred at last, snapped out of her paralysis just enough to realize how long she'd been standing there, numb and motionless.
Have I ever felt anything but the carnal sin of flesh? I have.
Why was she still listening to him? Why couldn't she stop hearing his words over and over again? She wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to remember. It is only a fantasy, he had said. But still, my heart is tortured by the disappointment of never being able to have it. Her head remained down, eyes fixed on the floor, but her hands began to move, lifting toward the zipper at the back of her red sundress. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the metal. What was she doing? Was she even aware? Was this decision hers? Had she stood up earlier with this in mind? She didn't know. She unzipped the dress anyway. Still staring blindly at the floor, her hands moved of their own accord, slipping the straps off her shoulders, letting the fabric fall. It whispered down her back and pulled at her feet like a puddle of spilled wine. Now she stood there in only her underwear, bare and motionless. She began to reach for her bra next, slowly, numbly, when a hand suddenly covered hers. Angus! His touch made her flinch. She hadn't even realized how close he'd gotten.
What the hell are you doing?
Angus's voice cut through the silence, authoritative, but edged with a note of something else. Something Florence had never heard from him before. Anxiety. Those first words, sudden and stark, echoed over and over in her ears. She wasn't sure what startled her more, his voice or the feel of his hand on hers. She began to lift her head, slowly, shakily, but stopped halfway. She couldn't bear to look at him. Her gaze instead locked onto that awful scarf around his neck as she took in a jagged breath.
What does it look like?
Her voice was quieter than his, but eerily composed. Like all the tears and tremors had been compressed into something numb, something hollow. She looked dazed more than anything. There was a pause. Then,
Why?
His tone was breathless. The question lingered in the space between them, unanswered. At last, she raised her eyes, bold and brown, full of defiance, and stared directly into his.
Does it matter?
He held her gaze. Her expression was cold, unforgiving. She hated him, that much was clear, and yet here she was. So what the hell did any of it mean? Angus sighed. Slowly he let go of her hand. It fell to her side like a dropped string. She didn't move. Now they were close, inches apart, face to face, neither speaking, neither breathing. It seemed. Their eyes locked with such intensity, it was as if they were trying to consume each other, absorb the answers the other wouldn't say aloud. The silence between them thickened, not peaceful, not still, but heavy and crushing, like it might swallow them whole. Desire, hesitation, anger, longing, it all tangled together in that quiet. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He had told her everything, exposed every raw nerve, and now he waited for her to want him, because despite all his obsession, his torment, his fury, that was what he wanted most of all, and what she wanted. God, he wasn't sure he'd ever been more uncertain in his life. Carefully, cautiously, he raised a hand and placed it on her shoulder. Even that small act sent a spike of nerves rushing through him. Still, she didn't flinch. She just stared at him, unmoving. Maybe he imagined it, or maybe there was something in her eyes that gave him permission, or maybe he simply couldn't help himself. Angus reached up, brushing her cheek with his fingers, palm warm against her skin. His other hand slid across her collarbone, ghosting along the curve of her neck. His touch was trembling, reverent. Then slowly, as if drawn by gravity, his hand moved up into her hair. His fingers threaded through it, cradling the back of her head, resting there at the base of her skull. He was holding her gently, like she was something holy, something sacred. Her big brown eyes remained locked on his, unblinking and unreadable. She didn't flinch, she didn't soften, her expression didn't change in the slightest, and still Angus watched her like a hawk, with a kind of obsessive, anxious craving that teetered between reverence and desperation. He leaned toward her and hesitated. The urge to touch her warred with the need to wait, to watch. He studied every flicker of movement, every breath, as though it might hold some hidden answer. Then, as the pressure to act finally won out over restraint, he let out a long breath and kissed her. The moment their lips touched, it felt like relief and fear crashed into each other inside him. It was everything and too much at once. It felt like eternity since he'd last tasted her, like she was water to a parched man, like she was oxygen after drowning. He kissed her like he couldn't help himself, like kissing her was a form of devotion, a prayer. At first she barely responded, but she didn't pull away, and that small allowance was all the encouragement he needed. Angus deepened the kiss, slipping his tongue against hers with urgent hunger, though his hands remained careful, tender. He cradled the back of her head, guiding her closer, drawing her in, His movements grew more fervent but never rough, as if he were trying to rewrite every brutal memory with something gentler. Florence remained still, her body frozen, her mind spinning, yet her mouth responded to his, hesitantly, mechanically, as if instinct were overriding thought. She could feel it, all of it, the weight of everything that had passed between them, every time he had forced his way into her life, every act of cruelty, every invasion of her space, her will, herself. And now this kiss, gentle where once he had been vicious, tender where once he had been violent. Was this some new form of manipulation? Was she betraying her own beliefs just by allowing it? Had she really forgotten everything he'd done? No. She hadn't forgotten. She couldn't. And that's when something in her snapped. Florence's hands moved at last, upward, toward his chest, and with sudden force, she shoved him away. Angus stumbled back a step, his eyes wide, startled. She took several steps backward herself, breath ragged, heart hammering. For a second, her gaze flicked up and caught his, and she finally noticed how blue his eyes were. A brilliant, unholy sapphire. Then she looked away. She couldn't keep looking at him. Not now. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths as she struggled to gather her thoughts. But all she could hear, all she could feel, was the echo of his voice, playing again and again like some cruel refrain.
Yes, Florence, I am desperately and tragically in love with you.
It made her stomach twist, made her knees tremble, and despite everything, despite all the pain, it had shaken her. Florence looked at him uncertainly, her eyes flickering toward the bed. She didn't speak, just moved, slowly, carefully. She crossed the room and sat down at its edge near the pillows, her shoulders tense, spine upright, like she wasn't sure whether she wanted to stay. Her gaze returned to Angus, who still stood by the fireside, motionless. His face was unreadable, yet somehow full of expression. Surprise, hope, guilt, even a flicker of that old bleak control. He didn't speak, didn't shift. He only watched her, a man who had never quite learned how to beg, but now found himself doing so with his eyes. Florence looked away again. She couldn't bear the weight of that stare. Her voice was small when she finally spoke, clipped and dry, laced with something sharp.
I still have to keep my promise to you, don't I?
The words were muttered more to the room than to him, but they landed between them like a dropped stone. There was venom in them, resentment, but also something else, a trace of embarrassment, a strange sort of invitation, like she was daring herself to follow through. He flinched, ever so slightly. It wasn't what he wanted to hear, not anymore. Not like this.
Florence, please don't. I don't want you to pretend.
She looked at him then, properly. Her expression wavered, uncertain, puzzled, as though she hadn't expected that from him. She didn't know how to respond. In truth, she didn't even know what she was doing anymore, or whether anything she did now could be called pretending.
I know that.
It was all she could manage, all she had to offer, but her eyes gave something more. Those deep, mournful eyes, dark and bruised with exhaustion and memory, met his with something closer to consent. Not eager, not even forgiving, but consenting. And that somehow was enough. Angus moved forward, slowly, deliberately, like a man approaching something sacred and forbidden all at once. He sat beside her, careful not to crowd her, giving her space to breathe, or run if she wanted to. He didn't speak. He only looked at her, quietly, devoutly, waiting. It wasn't lust that consumed him, not now, not entirely. It was need, it was longing, it was the aching, terrified desire to be let in, and the unbearable hope that she might finally choose him, not out of fear or duty or bitterness, but of her own accord. She met his gaze, still and silent. Her eyes were soft, but confused, naive, so painfully young, so haunted, There was something about her in that moment, a kind of clumsy grace, a shy gravity that made her seem untouched, unweathered by all that had happened, even though he knew that couldn't be true. He had taken that from her, no one else. And still, some part of her remained untouched by him, some quiet, sacred place in her soul that he hadn't broken, not entirely. And for the first time in his life, Angus Brady wanted to be careful enough not to break it. Still, she remained seated like a statue, unmoving, unreadable, neither inviting nor refusing. At last Angus lifted his hand, brushing her cheek with his palm. Her skin felt warm and impossibly fragile under his touch, and he held it there for a moment as though memorizing it. But Florence, startled by the contact, lowered her gaze again, and his hand hesitated, the motion suspended. She sighed, quietly, almost imperceptibly, then, without a word, shifted her body away from him, turning her back. Head bent, Florence slowly gathered her hair in her fingers, lifting the golden strands away from her neck and drawing them over one shoulder. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak, but the gesture was unmistakable. It was permission. And yet the air between them remained painfully heavy, charged and suffocating with everything unsaid. Angus moved closer, and after a brief pause, he let his fingers brush the bare skin just below the nape of her neck. Florence shivered involuntarily. Her breath caught. There was something wrong with this. She could feel it in her chest, a gnawing weight that curled inward like guilt, like shame. Something about even this small surrender made her feel sullied and strange. But she didn't move. She stayed perfectly still. Angus's hand slid lower, a slow, deliberate movement down the slope of her spine. Her heart pounded harder, her eyes slipped closed, and suddenly everything sharpened. The scent of cooling embers, the distant thunder beyond the windows, the patter of rain like a slow ticking clock. But all of it faded under the gravity of his hand. Each inch it traveled stirred up something different. The memory of past violence tangled with something newer, more uncertain. Her pulse stuttered, her face flushed with heat, and she hated the way her body was reacting, and yet there it was. A ghost of pleasure bloomed low in her stomach, wrong and inexplicable and real. He reached the center of her back, where the delicate hooks of her bra clasped together, and paused. And in the silence that followed, Florence could only sit there with her eyes closed and her breath held, consumed by a strange, conflicting ache that she wasn't yet brave enough to name. Outside, the occasional flicker of lightning cast sudden shadows across the room. The sound of thunder and relentless rain echoed softly through the silence, each burst of light exposing more of her to his gaze, and with it a deep, aching hunger. But something about the moment, the charged atmosphere between them, the truths laid bare, and even the things still unspoken, stopped him from giving in completely. His focus drifted to the pale curve of her neck, and then lower, to the vulnerable slope of her shoulder. The impulse to cover her in reverent, desperate kisses surged in his chest, to press his lips there, to let his hands and mouth offer something other than cruelty, to taste, to honor, not to harm. But instead of giving in to the storm inside him, Angus simply leaned closer and placed a single, tentative kiss against her skin. Florence didn't move, save for a small breath, sharp and uncertain. She stared down at a spot between her knees, her posture stiff with tension, her hands resting lightly on her thighs. But when he kissed her again, and then again, she didn't stop him. Each touch was slow, cautious. She trembled beneath it, not with fear, but with something quieter, something conflicted and complex. His hands rose once more, brushing along her shoulders, then sliding gently to the loosened fabric of her dress. He paused, and when she didn't object, he carefully began to undo the clasps of her bra, one by one. She didn't speak, but when she slipped her arms from the straps, her hand brushed his. She blushed, clearly flustered, unsure, and yet she let herself go on. When at last she was bare from the waist up, Angus sat motionless behind her, heart thudding. And then he saw them. With each flare of lightning, more of the bruises came into view, dark and swollen, scattered across her back and shoulders in haunting, ugly patterns, purple, blue, yellow. He stared, numb. His hands dropped from her skin, no longer filled with longing, only shame. He backed away, slightly, as if her body had struck him, and in a voice ragged with guilt, he whispered,
"It's too much, Florence. I can't."
Of course he'd known what he was doing when he hurt her 3 days ago. Of course there had been rage left in him. Jealousy, too. Sharp and stupid. But now, in the hush of the room with her wounds exposed and his guilt laid bare, nothing felt more real or more overwhelming than the shame. Florence, who had barely looked at him until now, slowly dropped her gaze to her legs. She had covered herself somewhat, her bra now resting loosely over her thighs, the rest of her small frame drawn inward. For a moment she sat frozen in that position, as if still trying to make sense of her own impulses. But then she turned, carefully, deliberately, to face him again. Their eyes met. He didn't move, and seeing his expression, dark, still unspeakably serious, made something inside her twist. She blushed furiously, heat rushing up her neck as a cold shame swept through her body. Without thinking, she crossed her arms over her chest, awkwardly shielding herself, her eyes darting from his face to the floor, then back again.
I don't know what to say. Angus, you did beat me. Mercilessly.
The words lingered between them, undeniable, and he didn't answer. He didn't have to. It was written across his entire face, the remorse, the guilt, the horror of what he had done, the knowledge that even an apology would feel inadequate now, too hollow, too late. And maybe she didn't want one. Maybe the memories were too raw to be soothed by words alone. He was a man of action, always had been, and she understood that now more than ever. With a long, shuddering breath, Florence moved closer. She could feel the shift in him immediately. His entire body seemed to tense, waiting, unsure. But then she looked up, and when her brown eyes met his blue, the silence between them finally softened. Without another word, she let her arms drop from her chest. Her hands found his shoulders, tentative at first, then firmer, and her lips brushed his. A question, a gesture, a response. He kissed her back. It was gentle at first, just pressure and breath, but then it deepened. His mouth warmed against hers, tentative but searching, until his tongue met hers and she didn't pull away. The next kiss came with more certainty, and then another, and another still. Each one a little less uncertain, each one a little more human. Angus's hands moved slowly, reverently, along the length of her bare back. He was careful, each touch measured, each motion mindful of her bruises. But even as guilt lingered in every movement, he couldn't deny the electric pulse of desire she had awakened in him, the ache to be near her, to hold her. He drew her closer, arms enveloping her torso, breathing her in like something sacred and fragile. Still, he held himself back. Still, he reined in the fire. He kissed her again, slowly, deeply, pouring all his restraint and tenderness into the rhythm of his mouth and the cradle of his palms on her spine. And then, unexpectedly,
Oh my.
Florence broke away, cheeks flushed, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down, or rather, at his cassock, at the black scarf hung around his neck. A barrier she hadn't dared to cross until now. Her hands rose shakily, brushing over the fabric with a tentative grace. She removed the scarf first, revealing the row of buttons beneath. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to undo them. 1, 2, 3, but each motion seemed harder than the last. Her hands were unsteady, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The fourth button wavered in her vision as panic and longing coiled inside her, muddling her resolve. Then Angus reached for her hands. He stilled them gently in his own, covering them with a touch so light it nearly undid her.
My dove, it's okay. I've got this.
She hesitated, then slowly let her arms fall away, lowering them to her sides without a word. Her gaze stayed fixed on his cassock, watching intently as he finished what she started. Unfastening the rest of the buttons, one by one, the dark cloth parted like a curtain, folding back over his shoulders and falling freely to either side of him. A quiet stillness followed, one that felt weightless and momentous at the same time. Florence's gaze was fixed, her attention drawn not to his eyes, but to the red, still fresh scratches etched across his chest, the only visible sign she had ever succeeded in leaving on him. They stood out against his pale skin like whispered defiance, raw remnants of her rage, and the only proof that she had ever tried to fight him. She stared at them in a quiet daze. Slowly, hesitantly, one hand rose. Her fingers, small and trembling, hovered above the wounds before lightly brushing against them. She began to trace each scratch, one by one, delicately, reverently, from the beginning to the end. Her touch lingered on every mark, following the jagged paths as if reading a secret message in braille. Her fingertips skimmed not only the wounds, but also the coarse silver threads of hair on his chest, and she could feel the rise and fall of his breath beneath her hand, uneven, heavy, restrained. She didn't dare look at him yet. She didn't have to. She could feel his eyes on her, unwavering, burning, waiting. The final scar ended just above his ribs. As her hand stilled, so did she, frozen, caught between memory and impulse. She swallowed hard, gathering the nerve to meet his gaze. When she finally looked up, their eyes locked. Hers were wide, shadowed with embarrassment and uncertainty. His were fixed, dark with longing and some deeper, unreadable ache. He didn't move. He didn't speak, but there was something in his expression, a silent dare, or maybe a plea, that asked her whether she would keep going, and whether she would let him do the same. Her fingers softened against his chest, no longer just the tips, but the full weight of her hand resting against him, hesitant but present. Florence backed away shyly, her head dipped, a long, sorrowful breath rising from her chest as she stepped toward the bed. With an awkward movement, dictated more by nerves than grace, she tossed aside the coverlet, leaving only the plain white sheet behind. She climbed onto the mattress in silence. When she looked at Angus, her glance was fleeting, uncertain. Then she lay back fully, her head resting against the pillow, her half-naked form trembling with anticipation and confusion. She stared up at the ceiling as though searching for answers in the blankness above, her breath shallow and uneven. Her heart was racing, her body was still. She didn't speak, and he didn't move, not at first. Angus watched her with a gaze that flickered between longing and restraint, absorbing every detail of her. Her posture was open, but her expression told another story. Uncertain, hesitant, far from seductive. He knew that look. She was vulnerable, and yet she was offering herself to him. His face remained serious, shadowed with a conflict she couldn't see. Somewhere in him, there was a part that wanted to stop this, to tell her she didn't have to do any of it, that she deserved gentleness, that she could sleep, uninterrupted, in a space where nothing was expected of her. But another part, the hungrier, more selfish part, feared he might never be this close to her again. And that was the part that moved first. He shifted closer, silent, deliberate. His hands reached for her, cool rings brushing against the warm skin just above her waist. Her body flinched, a shiver more from surprise than protest, but she didn't pull away. She simply closed her eyes. It wasn't a surrender, not entirely, but it wasn't rejection either. Florence shivered beneath his gaze, her body tingling with nerves and something else, something warmer, more electric. She was flushed, breathless, full of strange tension, as though her whole body had become a pulse. Her eyes never left his. Angus hovered over her, his expression caught somewhere between longing and restraint, shame and awe. For a moment they just stared, that same haunting, unreadable silence stretching between them like smoke. Then wordlessly, he kissed her again. Slower this time. Less a conquest, more a question. When she didn't pull away, he deepened it, their mouths meeting in quiet desperation, in reverence. The ache in both of them softened just a little under the weight of it. Whatever they were, sinners, survivors, something in between, they met in the half-light with nothing but bruises and want between them. And then without another word, he leaned forward, the firelight catching the lines of his face, the scars, the shadows, and the room slowly fell away. Angus, drenched in sweat and breathless, stared at her, at the tear tracing down her cheek, at her eyes still fixed on his. Her hands were on his back, then quickly pulled away with shy embarrassment, her silent weeping slipping past the bravado she had tried to maintain. He said nothing. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow? Instead, he rolled off her with a sigh, lying on his back and blindly fumbling for the duvet. He tossed it over himself carelessly, then more gently placed it over her. She clutched it to her chest like something precious, curling around the warmth and hiding her face in the folds. He didn't reach for her again. He couldn't. She was still crying, quietly, like she was trying not to, and he lay beside her, staring into the dark, his body cold with the chill of regret. She was the one in pieces, so why did he feel like the one who'd been shattered? Was that the price of love, or just the sentence?